I would no longer be able to go to Waverly Elementary because they were rezoning our area and they were going to be busing us into a brand new school. And so our complete routine changed. The new routine was my mom would drop me off at grandma's. It was grandma's responsibility to put me on the bus while my mom went on her commute. So the first week of school rolls around. First day or two, I recognized that this new school is no Waverly Elementary, and my new second grade teacher made it pretty clear that she was not too pleased with some of us who had now shown up in her classroom. But in my second grade mind, I thought, well, I can make the best of this. I love school. And so I remember kind of it was about the third day of school. The teacher said, on Friday, you can bring your items for show and tell. And I thought, yes, because I know how to do show and tell. So I got so excited. Ms. Brogan taught me how to do show and tell. So I'm excited. Friday rolls around. My mom gets me ready for school. And so she says, do you have everything you need? I said, yes, ma'am. And so she drops me off at grandma's, heads on her commute. I'm walking through the kitchen and have a meltdown in grandma's kitchen. And she said, child, what is wrong with you? Old country woman she is. And I'm going, I don't have anything for show and tell. And I see grandma kind of look around the room, and she goes over in the corner, scoops up something, sticks it in her pocket, grabs me by the hand, and we're running down the driveway to get the bus. The door's open. She goes in her pocket, puts something in my hand, and says, get on that bus. So I get on the bus, have a seat, and I open my hand, and it's a beautiful marble. One of the shooters that you break up the other marbles with, that she had just stolen from one of my boy cousins. And I thought to myself, I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it sure is pretty. And so I got to school, put my marble in my cubby right at our desk, and waited for the end of the day. And finally the teacher said, take out your items for show and tell. And right when she got ready, right when she said that, there was a little white boy sitting next to me. And he reached over in my cubby and grabbed my marble. And so I raised my hand to get her attention, and she turned away. And I raised my hand again. She looked at me and she turned away. And I raised my hand. I said, please, please. And so she finally came over to where we were sitting. And she said, what is it? And I said, he just took my marble. And so she looked at him and she said, did you take her marble? And he looked back at her and he said, I did not take that nigger's marble. Oh. And she turned back to me and said, don't you ever lie to me again. And I sat there that day and watched that little boy do show and tell with the marble my grandmother gave me. And in that moment, I went from being that happy-go-lucky little girl who was now someone who was very afraid, very insecure, who had just lost her voice, but more than anything, had just been excluded. So that's my story. And I share that story with my students because we operate from the premise that we are the sum total of our experiences, good, bad, and ugly. And I invite all of that to the classroom because I believe that that is where critical learning occurs, when we step into the courage to tell those stories. And I start with my own. And so I love this quote by Kanan. And he says, while one can dumb down his lyrics, what one cannot do without being found out is hide his historical baggage, his sense of self, his walk. I come with all the baggage of Somalia, of my grandfather's poetry, of pounding rhythms, of the war, of being an immigrant, of being an artist, of needing to explain a few things. Even in the friendliest of melodies, something in my voice stirs. And so I share that with my students, and we talk about what resonates with them when they think about their own stories. And so we start there, but we get there by getting to this place of being able to invite the stories of others. And what this really is a call for the integration of ourselves as a means to obtain authentic inclusionary practices in the classroom. So I actually do an exercise with them, and I spend a great deal of time in the classroom setting the stage for all of this to happen, but being able to have students tell their own stories, stepping into the courage to tell their stories, being vulnerable enough to tell their stories. Why do you think that's important? Just let me hear from you. Why do you think those stories are important as a foundational piece? Yes.
I think oftentimes, particularly when we're talking about inclusionary practices in this country, we don't invite the voice of whiteness as a story, but that is still the marker that everything else is judged by.
Absolutely.
And without knowing that piece of your own story, a lot of this stuff that we still deal with is going to be there.
Absolutely, Ebony, you are so right. In telling those stories, I've had white students say to me, Dr. K, thank you, because I was able to tell my story in a way that I didn't have to go through this diversity and inclusion course feeling this overwhelming sense of shame.
Mm-hmm.
Because I was able to tell my story and have it heard, even if it wasn't understood. I could still tell my story, because the story is not understanding someone else's story. The story is about hearing it. Hearing the story. And so being able to, any other thoughts about the value of story in establishing a learning foundation?
I think it is. Sorry, I was going to say the moral message that the story carries, and it really does help students understand moral reasoning and having a moral compass to figure out things.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I was going to say, I think it establishes trust between the teacher and the student, and so we don't know everything that goes on with the student or what their background is, and sharing that, it gives me knowledge, it gives them knowledge, and it establishes trust.
Absolutely. It creates a safe space.
Yeah.
And in creating the safe space, when I'm able to facilitate an opportunity for them together to create this safe space, the other things that I ask them to do evolve organically. Because I talk a lot about using your voice. Well, I could walk in the first day and say, you know, I want to hear everyone's voices. How many voices am I really going to hear? Authentic voices.
Right.
Not many. Because we haven't established the safety, we haven't created an inclusionary environment, so voices are not going to emerge organically, not authentic voices. And so that's extremely important. And so we look at diversity and inclusion simply through the way that Verna Myers describes it. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. And so I always ask students to engage each other in the dance. We came in here diverse, so we can check that off. We already accomplished that, done that. You woke up like that, if you will. And so we can look at diversity in that regard, but inclusion is the key, because that is the invitation to the dance. That is about inviting others to be a part of a conversation. It's inviting others to be vulnerable. It is inviting others to step into their courage. It is inviting others to tell their story. It is inviting others to honor the stories that they hear. And so that invitation is key to being able to include and ask others to dance. It's almost the difference, I see it between equity and equality.
Yes.
Equity and equality. Equality, you know, sometimes we get excited about equality, yay!
Mm-hmm.
You know, I talk to organizations all the time about diversity and inclusion, and they tell me, I got it, we do that, we have Taco Day every month.
Now it's multicultural diversity.
And you feel like you've made it. You know, that's why I don't even talk to organizations or my students about cultural competence. To me, that's a very arrogant place to live, because competence suggests you've
I've
made
arrived.
it. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
You've arrived. I've done that. I'm the expert. I talk about cultural congruence, an evolution, a continual processing to a place called there, but there is no arrival because we keep going. And so we talk a lot about this process of inclusion, the process and practice. And I love Ferdman and Roberts. The process and practice of inclusion begins with ourselves, identifying and affirming the multifaceted nature of our own self-concept and being strategic about how we engage various parts of ourselves to strengthen ourselves, our relationships, and our organizations. I talk to students about ownership. Ownership, to really have this inclusionary experience in the classroom, you've got to own it. Every person has a responsibility in owning how they include themselves and how they include others. So you don't get to point the finger and it doesn't become about they. We start with me. We start with me. And so there's that process. And even in having students think about the process and practice is when I start to interject this whole piece around the use of voice and bringing their voice to the conversation. And here's my mantra. If you're not going to engage in this process and practice, it's like anything else in the world. If you have a seat at the table and you refuse to use your voice, you can never complain when you become the meal. If you have a seat at the table and you refuse to use your voice, you can never complain when you become the meal. So you've got to engage in this process and in this practice. You've got to own it. It's about ownership. And so we look a lot at personal inclusion. Again, it starts with ourselves, recognizing and honoring all of our various components, our characteristics, our identities that work together to make the whole person. I love that Ferdman and Roberts talks a lot about personal inclusion. And we operate from that premise in the classroom. And so here's the model I created for our students to really kind of delve deeply into the how do I get there. So one of the exercises that we do to kind of set the stage is using this me, myself, and I model. So they talk about in small groups, they start with me. Who have I been? That's that storytelling piece. Being able to reflect back over your past and think about who have I been? What did I bring with me into the classroom because of what I've been? It's that historical baggage that Kanan talks about. So it's about how do I start to unpack that baggage? And something strange really happens when I watch that. Students get to explore areas that they have not explored. Why? Because that part of their baggage has been situated in their culture, in their orientation, and no one has ever asked them to engage it, to unpack that. And so when they start to unpack it, something amazing happens. I had one student say to me, Dr. K, we had spring break And when she came back, she said, Dr. K, I don't know if I'm going to be invited to any more family gatherings. And I said, why not? And she said, because for the first time ever, I recognized that the jokes were not funny anymore. My heart to correct people I love, because now I'm able to see differently. And so you talked, Dr. King, about the transformation.
Mm-hmm.
So watching that transformation happen, just because she was able to start unpacking parts of her culture
Mm-hmm.
that she had never explored, but recognizing these are also parts of the culture that will render me dysfunctional
Mm-hmm.
if I don't address it. And so really investigating the me, the who I have been, and then helping them focus on myself. Who am I now? Who am I now? So we revisit this model throughout the semester. Who I have been, who am I now? What do I bring? Where am I standing in? How am I situated? How am I posturing myself as a learner? I call every student a world changer. And I was sharing this with Ben. Not because I believe that I can inspire them to go out and change the whole wide world, but I do believe that I can inspire them to change the world where they are. So wherever they show up, that they are compelled and inspired to do something right where they are. So we spend a lot of time on the myself, and then having them look forward. Who am I becoming? How do I see myself in the future? Where do I see myself? How am I evolving? What do I want to be? So when I step out into the field, who am I becoming? Who am I when I get there? So helping them to look at that. So taking this holistic approach to inclusion. So I'll pause here and have you ask any questions or even invite any thoughts that you have about this personal inclusivity model.